Good evening, mi gente. This is Ray Collazo. You're watching and listening to a special Friday night special live edition of the BOMBA Live Final Translation simulcast. Final Translations to show the sex truth about politics and today's hottest issues. And BOMBA Live is our perpetual virtual Puerto Rican celebration. We're going to have more updates later in the show about BOMBA Live 2, which is taking place Saturday, June 12th. You're not going to want to miss it. It's going to be an over 10-hour virtual fiesta celebrating the talent, character, and perseverance of the Puerto Rican community on the island and throughout the diaspora and throughout the world. And we have a couple of leaders that are also very involved in those issues. And we're going to talk later in the show about the intersection between racial justice, whether it's criminal justice reform, racial equity from an economic perspective, and even the ongoing sort of inequities as it relates to the island of Puerto Rico. Again, this is your host, Ray Collazo. We really appreciate this special edition. And it's great to be hanging out with you all on a Friday night. I know you're probably your leg kicked back, maybe have a beverage or stimulant of your choice. And we just want to make sure people are part of this conversation. We encourage interaction on the chat. And we definitely want this to be a conversation where we're learning from each other and also, sharing best practices around the many issues related to the cannabis industry and this very special cannabis edition of the show. The person who brought this to the table is sort of just kind of waiting patiently for us to get this on the calendar. Is a great addition to the show. The person that really is the person that really gave us the platform on WPPMOP 106.5 FM to take this show to the next level, and someone that's not only a big part of the Founding Translation BOMBA Life family, but a fantastic activist, and in this case, a cannabis activist, and someone who's going to be a big part of BOMBA Life 2 in June 12th. We're going to talk about that. Vanessa Maria Graber. What's up, Vanessa? How are you? Let's get unmuted, Vanessa.
Hola, mi gente. How is everybody doing tonight? Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday special edition. I'm really excited for this show because this is our week, right? 420 was this week, and for people who use cannabis, people involved in the cannabis field, it's really our holiday. So it's really fun to keep talking about this wonderful plant and to be able to share some knowledge and information and raise awareness on the show. So thanks for having me.
No, this is a lot of fun. I mean, 420 was a big deal. Fat Joe didn't even do his IG because he's like, well, it's 420. I mean, we got to let Meth and Redman take the stage on the musical front. And it's so interesting because, Vanessa, you're making me a lot cooler because more than one person, I'm gonna be honest with you, behind the curtain here, sent me a note and said, wow, you're really gonna do a cannabis episode? So it's like, how dorky am I that people didn't even think I was capable of doing this and open minds to this conversation? But you're putting up my it factor, Vanessa. So thank you.
Well, it's a political issue, just like all the other ones we cover. Absolutely. And it has intersections with a lot of other things. So why wouldn't we cover cannabis?
Exactly. That's how I look at it. So no question about it. Vanessa, before we get to our great panel, and we've got experts that are really going to cover all elements of it as it relates to how cannabis impacts us from a public health perspective, the business of cannabis, right? Sort of wealth equity and racial equity in a multi-billion-dollar industry. And of course, how it relates to criminal justice and that's really top of mind. Before we get to our panel, Vanessa, just very quickly, I wanted to make sure we had a moment to sort of honor the memories of that young man, Adam Toledo in Chicago. I'm sorry with the names, but George Floyd,
Dante Wright,
Mikaya
Bryant.
Mikaya Bryant, that was the name that was escaping me. We lost all of them way too early in their lives, and there's so many incidents. We become numb to it, but just wanted you to have a moment. Vanessa, this is so intertwined with the criminal justice conversation, the policing conversation we're having in our country. So just wanted to give you a moment to reflect on, the verdict and the subsequent incidents that we're equally horrified by as we begin this discussion today.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge it's been a really heavy week, even though it's, Earth Day was yesterday and 420, and there's things that we're definitely celebrating. There's been a lot of people, struggling and a lot of pain that people are feeling this week. Consuming the news about the trial and about these other deaths, it is really hard. And as a journalist, I often hear people say, I just can't listen to the news anymore. It's too painful. And I totally want to acknowledge that and recognize that our communities are in pain right now. And just because there is a guilty verdict doesn't erase the centuries of damage and harm that's been done in the community. And you saw that we did not get a respite, after the verdict was announced. That same day, we learned the plight of young Mikaya Bryant, a 16-year-old from Columbus, Ohio, who was shot dead by a police officer. She called for help after, experiencing an attack or feeling threatened by these other girls. And in the end, she's the one who lost her life. The funeral of Dante Wright also happened this week. Many people were there speaking, a lot of, famous people, a lot of community leaders and movement leaders. And when I researched Dante Wright, just to connect it to the topic at hand, he was originally being arrested after being pulled over for, the air freshener being in the rearview mirror. They found that he had a warrant for his arrest, and that warrant stemmed from a marijuana arrest, right? He was convicted of a marijuana possession charge and was in some type of deferment program where he had to pay a fine. He was not able to pay that fine during a pandemic. And because he missed a payment or two, they sent that to collections and put a warrant for his arrest. So again, if you look at the case in its entirety, this war on drugs, making marijuana illegal, has really hurt so many people in our community. So much of the stop and frisk that happens in Philadelphia still and in places across the country as they're looking for marijuana, they're looking for drugs. And so again, there's a lot of intersections on this issue. What I want to say is that, this movement is not over, right? There are still a lot of struggling, and in reality, it's a lifelong struggle for justice, for freedom, for liberation. And Black people and Latinos, we need to unite. We need to work together. This affects both of our communities in different ways, but we have to continue to educate ourselves, show solidarity, and show compassion to people who are, dealing with these very, very traumatic issues. It's a trauma to watch the news on a week like this. So I just want to recognize that, and from the BOMBA Live family, like we care about all of these issues. That's the reason why we do these shows, so we can have a dialogue about it that's constructive, and so we can learn from each other, because telling our story, hearing what's happening to people in other communities is really, really important for all of these movements. So hopefully today we could continue telling these stories and educating people and, working collectively to dismantle this really evil police and carceral state that has abused and killed so many of our people.
And it's not only sort of a more obvious, which there's such a need for it, and so well said, Vanessa, sort of Blacks and Latinos and other disenfranchised communities working together. But this is sort of a battle within the identity of the Latino community. Let's not forget that the cop that shamefully harassed and pepper sprayed a proud member of our armed forces, that gentleman, Nelson Carmona, I believe his name was, the police officer, the Army gentleman that was a Latino cop that harassed him. An Afro-Latino in the military.
George Zimmerman was Latino, right?
The cop that killed Philando Castile, Minnesota, was Latino. Mm-hmm. And we have, many cases on all those California cases that we're monitoring, Sean Monterroso and other. A lot of times the Latino cops are involved. So this is sort of a battle for our soul and identity. And quite honestly, the next generation of our politics nationally is going to be this battle between Latinos that have a grounding of self and understand the foundations of white supremacy, and some that are like, you know what, I'm going to try to grab onto some of that whiteness to try to get a step ahead. So it's really a fundamental conversation we're having in our community. I know Vanessa, you want to bring our great friends to the table. The first one I introduce is a mutual great friend of ours that I want to make sure we properly introduce, the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And our go-to in CT, brother. My man, Jason Ortiz. Jason, buenas noches, hermano.
Our Boricua brother from Connecticut.
That's
welcome.
Right. The next great hope in cannabis legalization, Connecticut.
No question, brother.
Jason's been busy this past couple of weeks. He's at war in Connecticut. Tell us about
and I feel like a happy warrior about it. You know, we had a great 420. We had some tremendous turnout. The press coverage of our event was fantastic. Our bill is making moves. So, you know, I feel pretty good, even though it is definitely a complicated time.
So let's take a step back, Jason, for those that don't know you, and you're involved in, a lot of people know you from the Puerto Rican advocacy space, of course, and sort of progressive politics generally. But why don't you share with us, how did, as sort of a Latino activist, a Puerto Rican activist, but very much engaged in sort of the intersectionality of these issues, how did the cannabis movement become so central to your organizing platform?
For sure. And so just quickly, again, my name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the executive director of SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And we're a nonprofit that organizes and mobilizes youth that use drugs throughout the world. We actually are in 30 different countries to change the drug policies in their home communities, to be more sensible, to be more compassionate, and just to be more effective at addressing the harms that could be caused by drugs, but also learning what we can benefit from using drugs in our societies. And so I also served on the board of the National Puerto Rican Agenda for 2 years, more or less, a little more than that. I was the president of their Connecticut chapter here in Connecticut. I've lived in Puerto Rico many times. My family is from Añasco, Puerto Rico, which is on the West Coast. And so I've been fighting for the liberation of Puerto Rico for a very long time. But even before I was organizing on Puerto Rico, I learned about the drug war when I was arrested in high school at the age of 16. So that was my first introduction into law, into policy, into any of these different things that would, you know, eventually become really important parts of my life. But I was walking to school with some friends smoking cannabis on the way to school, and somebody called in, and the security guards got us as soon as we got on campus. And I can tell you, and they called the police immediately. I was really surprised at how aggressive they were with us. But for those who have never been arrested, I can tell you that when somebody puts handcuffs on you and you feel like actual cold steel chains on your wrists, it changes your perspective on, you know, power in society. And so that was the first day that I got brought into the cannabis justice movement, was when I got to see how folks are treated by the criminal justice system. And so that was really disruptive. I got thrown out of school. I did graduate high school. I was never incarcerated, but almost only because we paid tremendous amounts of money to lawyers to not go to jail, which was definitely difficult for a Puerto Rican family, 2 union, state workers. It was a tremendous amount of money for us to pay up at the time over something that really hadn't hurt anybody. But fortunately, I did have a strong family that was there and supportive, and I was able to graduate and eventually went to the University of Connecticut. And at the University of Connecticut is where I first found SSDP, actually. I was able to organize with other students there on how to address things like Good Samaritan policies on campus, and making sure that if somebody calls 911 when somebody's overdosing, the person calling 911 doesn't get arrested for being in the vicinity of drug use. And so, that was my first introduction to harm reduction as a philosophy. But it was at UConn that I realized the student activists that came before me changed a very important law called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty. It's a really long name to say if you got caught with weed, you couldn't access financial aid. And so it affected lots of people. I was one of those students that got caught in high school and would have needed financial aid to get into college. And luckily, SSDP and other activists like Vanessa and other folks that have been working on this for a long time changed that penalty so that you only lost your financial aid if you got caught while you're in college, meaning everyone that got caught in high school could now go to college. And I was one of those people. And so not only was I negatively impacted by the war on drugs, but I was positively impacted by the activism to change the war on drugs. And that's how I was able to find SSDP and then eventually join the board and be on the national board and train students from around the world and how to do direct action tactics, strategies, and tactics, campaign planning, all of that great stuff. And it's where I met a lot of my favorite Latino and Puerto Rican activists, actually, was through drug policy. And so from there, I actually was also recruited to the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which is where I met Nelson and many of my other cannabis compadres, doing our model equity policies through MCBA. And in the cannabis industry space, when I shifted over into more the business side of it, I noticed even among communities of color, Latinos were underrepresented even in those rooms. I was still one of the few Latinos in an all-black room, and that didn't feel great. It felt better than being in an all-white room, but I still wanted to be with my people. And so from there, I was able to meet lots of other people like Nelson, like Jessica, and we were able to start to develop a little, community of Latinos in cannabis. And that has really changed my ability to organize. And so having that kind of backup of folks from my community that are able to support us and come to different states and move different places has just been so vital. So, it's been a full circle experience of, dealing with the criminal justice system, but then so supported by my people in the grand scheme of things that, I really have incredible optimism for the future. And so again, thank you so much for having this forum. And the more that Latinos can be talking about these issues, the more that we have abuelas meeting with nietos and talking about what is, cannabis medicine. Because I had to have that conversation with my grandma recently, which was an interesting one. I think we'll be able to ensure that Latino communities benefit not just from the legalization in a financial sense, but also a higher quality of life for our seniors. Because cannabis medicine can provide some really incredible benefits for folks that are maybe suffering unnecessarily. So I think we have a lot of work to do internally, educating each other on how we can benefit from this plant, destigmatizing its use, and also making sure that all of us are able to start businesses just like every other community will be when it becomes legal. So excited to work on all of those different things with these folks and talk about how the broader Latino community can really utilize its buying power as a block, right, to shape the market and the policies moving forward.
Yeah, it's so important, as you said, to have Latinos represented in these spaces, because even though we're all organizing around a common problem, right, our community has some things that are unique about it, right? And one of the things that is often a problem is having information in Spanish, right? And or Spanglish, right? Like being able to speak the language of the people and in different dialects of Spanish, because certainly the Spanish that we speak is not the same as what people speak in other parts of Latin America. And then also, we have some things that are specific to us when it comes to ICE and immigration and decolonizing Puerto Rico. And we also have a really, really large population of young people under the age of 25. And those same young people, like Adam Toledo, are being targeted by the police. And so, in North Philly, where I am, you see Black and Puerto Rican kids get arrested together. And so, again, it's important to have representation in these spaces. But not only that, it's important to form these organizations like the Minority Cannabis Business, where we can not only be represented, because we already know about diversity, but also being able to shape the agenda and the policy and the decisions that are being made when it comes to cannabis policy and legislation. So I'm so glad to have you here. A little bit later in the show, we'll talk more about your efforts in Puerto Rico, because again, this is a global movement, and Latin America is also organizing around cannabis. So we're seeing this green wave spread far and wide.
Absolutely. And I think, one thing I'll put on there before we move on, the idea of cannabis equity has become rather accepted in traditional circles now when it comes to policy, that we say what the United States did to our communities of color was wrong and we should make amends for that. The next conversation we have to talk about is what the war on drugs did to Latin America. And that scale of the damage done with things like Plan Colombia, where we dumped poison all over the rainforest in order to address drug control issues, right? That's the conversation we're going to need to have as a community. And I think folks underestimate how powerful that conversation will be. A lot of our immigration concerns, a lot of the narco issues in the various countries are due to drug policy. Right?
And gun violence, right? Like gun violence in a lot of our cities is tied to the drug war.
Right.
And so it's important to just make all of those connections.
Yep.
Vanessa, why don't I leave it up to you and Jason to introduce our other panelists?
All right. So we have with us two of our friends and our colleagues. We have Jess F. Gonzalez. She is La Cana Bogada, the cannabis attorney that we all know and love.
Best IG handle of the week, no question about it.
Absolutely. Jess has been everywhere. Jessica is always on a panel somewhere doing a lot of education and advocacy work. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Jessica is also general policy or general counsel for Minorities for Medical Marijuana, and has been really involved in the discussions, conversation, advocacy efforts in the state of New Jersey, which just legalized cannabis. Yay!
Awesome.
Thanks for being here, Jessica.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
And we also have with us Nelson Guerrero. He is the executive director of the Cannabis Cultural Association, based out of New York, our neighbors to the north, also just legalized.
With homegrown.
Right, I know, don't rub it in.
Right.
Oh, the shade, the homegrown shade.
I know. Well, you know, they saw the New Jersey legislation. And
I love
were
this
like,
cannabis
"We're not
activism humor.
doing that. The Cannabis Cultural Organization is also involved in education and advocacy efforts and social equity policy making, and they have been really active and throughout the whole region. So thank you so much, Nelson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Wow, really excited to have you both on. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to hear from Jess first because, you know, Jess, obviously, you know, in your legal world, you could be literally any other focus you could have as opposed to your specialty. But what drew you to sort of the legal issues related to cannabis?
Sure. So when I was first, well, actually, let's take it back to to law school, right? Where I always actually used to joke about becoming a cannabis attorney. I just never thought it was something that was a possibility at that time. But I was the one that smelled like weed. I was the one that had weed. I was the one that knew where to get weed. And so I always used to joke about it. And then when I started working as an actual attorney in New Jersey in intellectual property and really in the entertainment space, I found that I wasn't particularly passionate about that. So I really had to do kind of a deep dive of if I'm going to continue this route, I'm not going to be a lawyer, but must be something that I can do. And this was around the time, late 2017, when Governor Murphy of New Jersey announced that, that he got elected and he was going to legalize cannabis within this first 100 days, which, as we all know, did not occur. But to me, this seemed like, well, I'd been a consumer of the plant at that point for 11 years. It was something that was very personal to me. It was the type of plant that I always advocated for, at family events or anytime anybody brought it up, to the point that, my mom would always say, like, mijita, por favor, like, not here, please don't do that. And I would tell her, I'm like, listen, but if they're going to say something that's inaccurate, like, I really have to, stand up for it. So I guess I got a lot of my advocacy practice at different family events, because my family were all immigrants to this country. So they still hold, really a lot of those cultural ties. And so, what Jason spoke to before is when you have the conversation, with the Latino community, sometimes they don't really care about the war on drugs in the US. They care about what happened in their country and how that affected them. So when I started to get involved in cannabis, I started to recognize that the rooms were primarily white. The speakers were white. The educators were white. And yet they were in communities like Jersey City, where I'm from, that is the most diverse city in the US. So I could not believe it. So I got involved. I educated myself tremendously, because obviously this is not something you learn in law school. And then when I started to learn about the history of cannabis, I would say that, for a long period of time, I was an uninformed consumer. And when I started to really get involved and really kind of peeling back the layers of what was going on, I decided that I had to leverage my own privilege to this space, because I understand policy, I understand legal language. I'm a US citizen, I speak English. And I just didn't see a lot of, Latinos, and definitely not Latino lawyers, really taking a really strong stance on social equity. And so I figured, well, I might as well do it, why not me? And so that really helped, propel me forward in this space. And it really helped to me meet a lot of really inspirational people like you folks, on this. And so that's really what I have been, fighting for in New Jersey as well. So fight is still not over, even though, we legalized. New York definitely showed us up, with their policy, but I definitely appreciate that, because that's exactly what I'm going to leverage here.
Yeah, and especially being up there in Jersey City, where people cross the border all the time into New York. Same way we cross state lines in Philly and New Jersey. So there has to be some consistency with the laws around there because people are migrating and traveling everywhere for work. Nelson, we go back a while. I met Nelson at a protest. He came to Philly for this crazy protest that we had during the Democratic National Convention. and he drove all the way down from New York City and gave a wonderful speech. Tell us a little bit about your cannabis journey and how you all decided to form the Cannabis Cultural Association, because you're a co-founder along with Jake Plowden and many other great advocates from New York.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Vanessa. Well, my journey with cannabis kind of similarly started at Jess's. I'm Ecuadorian, first generation here, super católicos. So I grew up hearing marihuana, solo para marihuaneros, los vagos. Like that's what I grew up with. There's nothing good side of the marijuana. Only the worst people do it. And it's funny, I was probably a late bloomer. I was pretty much a late bloomer when it came to the cannabis. I didn't try it till I was in late high school, early college for athletic purposes, for pain management. But what really drove me into the space was back in 2015. My abuelo, he has prostate cancer. He's had it for over 20 years. But in 2015, he was diagnosed that it had come back. And it was now stage 4 and metastasized. For somebody that's in their late 70s, early 80s, the only really options there are trying chemo again, which there's a very high probability where chemo might, the after effects of chemo might actually take his life rather than the cancer itself. So at that time, I was living and working in Ecuador. I had to have a very, very difficult conversation with my abuelito, because I had done a lot of research. I'd always been very interested in cannabis space. I said, we can try cannabis oil. It looks like there's a lot of really good effects for it when it comes to prostate cancer. At the very least, abuelito, it'll open up your appetite, might help you with some of the pain. So after some very difficult conversations, they agreed, and that's kind of how my cannabis story started there. Me and my primo drove around the entire south side of the country trying to find the best cannabis, that had a good THC to CBD ratio, not having any, trained equipment, just going off what we were learning off the internet. And when I finally found some good cannabis at a university of all places, of course, it was at that point that I made my first batch of Rick Simpson oil for him off a recipe that I found on the internet, off YouTube. Totally stunk up my tío's house making it. And then that day we started giving it to my abuelo. Thank God, 6 years later, abuelito's still here with us. He's doing well. He's got full appetite. And even for a cancer patient whose cancer is now spread to other parts of his body, the biggest bendición is he doesn't have any pain. And that for us, 6 years later, abuelito's still here with us. So I'm very blessed that I was able to have that experience, because when I first started doing this with my abuelo, everyone in my family thought I was trying to be a mini Pablo. I was trying to drug deal. I was just trying to use abuelo to promote whatever I was doing. But the results speak for himself. He's 6 years later. He still has stage 4 cancer. It's still metastasized. Abuelito's doing incredibly well for all things considered. And it was with that momentum when I came back to New York. I could, tell my parents that, hey, I want to go into the cannabis space. You see the good it's done. It's time for me to be active and be, a bilingual voice in this movement. And at the time, this is 2016 at this point, I would go to these different industry events. And similar to Jason's experience, most of these industry events, mainly all white, old white folks talking about cannabis. And, since I was fresh out of college, there was a lot of these events that I couldn't afford to go to. So I'd sneak into them at the end or I'd volunteer. But it was at one of these events, one of my co-founders asked the question of how do we get more people that look like us involved in the space. My co-founder is African-American. He pointed at me like, how do we get more Black and brown folks in this? No one really gave us a straight answer at that time. It was 2016, so cannabis wasn't as free as it is now in comparison. So we said we're going to do it ourselves. And then we were fortunate enough to I had already purchased the Cannabis Cultural Association domain. My co-founder Jake came up with the name. It all just kind of was like a perfect synergy of just ideas, and we just went from there. With no business plan, no real guide. We started pitching this around, and thankfully we were able to team up with other PT and some other great lawyers to really become a 501c3. It's a nonprofit with cannabis in our name. And obviously that's come with a lot of hiccups and headaches, but it's been a great honor to continue this good fight along with some of the vets and everyone else I've met in the space. and, just pushing the momentum forward. New York is now legal. We have a really great opportunity here to really set the standard for the world. Everyone always pays attention to New York. It's that big giant on the East Coast that hopefully, does this program the right way.
It's so interesting, Vanessa, because to hear Nelson's story, so many of us come into the cannabis space from different avenues, but I'm so glad Nelson shared that story. First of all, I'm glad your abuelo is doing well, but the lesson I'm getting out of that is, that the organizing y'all are doing is affecting real people in real ways. This isn't hypothetical. You just want to do it for fun on the weekends and make your grandfather upset. This impacts our community in so many different ways, from a health perspective, the business of it, which we want to talk to you more about, Nelson, and Jess, in your area, the criminalization and the mass criminalization of our communities using, basically these things like marijuana and poverty and paying a ticket and spiraling into a situation where our young people, in the case of Jason, get caught up in the criminal justice system for what, right? So, Vanessa, do you have a comment or a last question before we go to our first break?
Yeah, no, I'll just say that, it's all of these things. Cannabis is a life-saving medicine. It is keeping people alive. It is helping people exit opiate addiction. It is helping people maintain a healthier lifestyle, because once you get opened up to the cannabis community, you start meeting people who are all about plant-based diets and mindfulness and spirituality and yoga. And there really is this overlap with people who want to be healthy. And our community, very much like African Americans, are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, by heart disease, by high blood pressure, asthma, diabetes. And so once you embark on that path, to learn about alternative medicines and healthier lifestyles, you really can enjoy a longer, healthier quality of life. And so when people look at us and they say, oh, you just want to smoke weed and you just want to get high, that's the stigma we have to break with education, by explaining to people how endocannabinoids work, the different strains, the difference between CBD, hemp, cannabis, right? I mean, all these things are very new to people still and very complex. So it requires free education like this, because Nelson's right. A lot of these conventions and seminars, they're expensive, and it keeps people like us out of those spaces.
And that's done on purpose, because this not just big is like an understatement. This is the humongous industry here that they're trying to hold on to.
Mm-hmm. So we're promoting health and wellness. We're also, in solidarity with this anti-police brutality movement and decarceration. And at the same time, we know that our communities are struggling economically, especially immigrants and our family coming from Puerto Rico. They come here seeking a better life, and there's not a lot of opportunities. And so this is a viable way for people to generate wealth and then generate generational wealth, right? That we can pass on to our children. And those are the things that are really important. And so again, part of, I think, all of our collective mission is to end the stigma with cannabis in our communities. And that begins with something you all said, right? Having these tough conversations, starting with your family.
That's right. And we're talking to Vanessa, Jess F, Gonzalez, Nelson Guerrero, Jason Ortiz, great friends to the show. And we're going to take a quick commercial break. I was thinking about you, Jason. I brought you back up real quick. Vanessa brought up Puerto Rico. And I'm just thinking that's connected to the whole crypto bully vulture situation going on.
Let's go. Let's talk about all of that.
They're talking about that. And, anyway, about our land and gentrification, because that's an agenda, right? Where else better to grow it than in the tropics? But when we come back, we're going to talk to y'all about all the above, how this impacts our health, business, wealth building, and, the criminal justice system in the Latino community. Jess will get the first question on that. But when we come back, before we continue the conversation on this very special cannabis edition of Found in Translation BOMBA Live Simulcast, me and Vanessa got a couple updates about BOMBA Live 2, which we got to lay out to y'all. We got some big announcements, some A-listers, and some exciting events. So during our break, we're going to hear from two voices. One is Luis Suave Gonzalez, who's become one of the national figures as it relates to the Juvenile Justice Network, a great personal friend to our program, and me and Vanessa, who was on recently. So we're going to hear a few words from his recent appearance. And we're going to hear from the primetime host of BOMBA Live 2 and one of the freestyle divas, Betty from Sweet Sensation, who during her announcement, when she was announced she's going to be the primetime host, called out a couple of her celebrity buddies in a very special way. So we're going to hear from our friends and come back with Vanessa and the crew on this very special edition of Bomba Live.
I want people to know that we are more than our worst mistake. And if you don't have no compassion, then you don't have a right to be in the business of talking to people, period. And I found in Maria's friendship what I didn't find in the school system, what I didn't find in my household or in my community, which was compassion and empathy.
We are going to have amazing contributors to the community. We're going to have such amazing talent. And I'm putting it out here now live. I'm calling all of you, all my friends. We're going to do this. So look into my eyes and just say yes. So all of you are watching it. We're going to have
I
some
think she
amazing
turned down the
talent.
gauntlet to a couple other listeners.
I did. I came. I'm like, listen,
right there. I like
I'm
that.
talking to you. Yes, my friends. You all know who you are, my freestyle friends, all my salsa friends. We're going to do this. This is going to be a great collaboration. And I'm excited. I'm excited to actually be able to meet these community leaders and these impactful people that, because so here's the truth, okay? This is the opposite end of the spectrum for me. I hang out with freestyle artists and other artists and entertainers. That's my life. What really brings me passion on the other side of me is meeting all these, amazing community leaders and people who make an impact. And these superheroes is what I call them. That's who I fangirl on.
Well, she got plenty to fangirl on here. June 12th, Bomba Live 2. Vanessa is going to be so exciting. So let's let our folks get in the background here. Vanessa, first of all, June 12th. Let me talk to me. I know you're excited. This is going to be.
Well, if folks
we're taking it to the next level. No question about it.
If folks missed it last year, they should go back and see it because it's all online available
on YouTube. Bomba Live YouTube page.
It's really a celebration of our culture, of our people, the talent that we have, the knowledge. There's music, there's performances, there's education. And originally when you conceived of the idea, it was because all the events were canceled. So it's like, how do we still have a Puerto Rican Day Parade? How do we celebrate our culture in a different way? And so it was so exciting to experiment with this medium and be able to pull off an 8-hour-long live program. So this is the second annual, right? Because it's going to be a yearly thing. And we're going to have a ton of amazing presenters, guest hosts. We're going to give out awards. There's be more musical performances. So even if you can just tune in for a little bit, definitely check it out. And again, everything is recorded. So if you're not able to join that day, you can go back and listen and share with your friends. But I mean, I was really left just totally proud and so inspired. And I think, again, after heavy weeks like this, we really need our peoples, right? We really need this type of inspiration and connection that we have with one another, because we're sprinkled all over the world, right? And so it's really cool to come together and celebrate.
It's going to be an amazing show, and there's so many announcements, so much that's going to happen. Vanessa is going to be a big part of the program, behind and in front and behind the camera, but just a couple of many things we could be talking about here. So we have an honoree that's confirmed that, Vanessa, you're really going to love this story. So we've identified there is a young, well, let's bring her, let me show you the picture of her. For people who don't know who this young woman is, her name is Roselyn Rosario Melendez, Vanessa. I don't know if you know who this young woman is, but but Roselyn Rosario Melendez is one of the world's great scientists and chemists in the makeup industry. And she has invented over 25 lipsticks in cosmetics. She has the patent for them. That means she's getting paid. You talk about music royalties are profitable. Try a couple patents. And a few of her lipsticks are amongst the top selling lipsticks in the world. So she is going to be honored with our first ever Bomba Live award for excellence in STEM for Puerto Ricans. Young Puerto Rican woman, crió en the campo in Puerto Rico. I think she's from Ay Bonito or Garanquitas, one of those little towns on the island. Came to the mainland for school, and is one of the great makeup scientists, chemists in the world. So really honored to have Roselyn. She's been so humble. She actually has a wedding that night as a friend, and she's going to pull away and making very, very accommodating us that night to be awarded. So we want to give our love to the Latinas in STEM. I mean, Vanessa, is there anything better than that? Young Puerto Rican woman getting paid, doing her thing in sciences in the STEM
I love
industry.
it. I love seeing Latina women succeed. And again, you know, the part that I'm playing in BOMBA Live is doing tech, being behind the scenes with Albert. And we need more women in STEM. We need more women doing tech.
Absolutely.
We need more women in cannabis. So always happy to see people like that succeed and get the flowers that they deserve, right? Because too often people don't get the recognition while they're still alive. So glad to be part of that on BOMBA Live.
And Vanessa, you know, had to get the eye candy and the celebrity, the wow factor, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to put him out here. He's going to be there too. You can hang out with him. This, of course, is the swing kid himself. K7 from TK is going to be in the house.
Yo, my first CD was K7.
Louder Than Love.
It was. That was the first. Yes. And I had every TKA mixtape, so I'm a diehard fan. I'm so.
I know, but let's look at him again. He's doing so good. I know y'all are excited. We're gonna have a great show. Let's bring our panel back. And as I said before the break, I definitely want to start with you, Jess, if you don't mind, because it's just hard for me to wrap my mind around this whole legal piece. We'll get to Jason Nelson in a second. They have so much to share on the show because, you know, I can't tell you the stories. All my homies. I mean, Jason shared a very similar tale. I have 7 friends that have a similar story to that. That, you know, lives get ruined over pot, and to this day, and they still do. And we're still paying for it, whether it's the legal fees or what's on your record. The states, all the state laws are different. The federal government hasn't weighed in the way they need to. You know, some of us are making billions and some of us are getting locked up for basically doing the same thing. So just help us. How do we just wrap our minds around as criminal justice activists, where do we begin and how do we engage in this issue from that lens?
And like Ray, I just want to make one more point because what's happening in New Jersey, right? Like it's legalized in New Jersey, but there's like a little asterisk there, right? It's not legal for everybody. And so I think I want to ask a more pointed question, which is, even in legal states, how do we ensure that Latinos and Black people and others are not continue to be harassed and criminalized for doing the same thing that white people are doing, white corporations are doing? And that's the concern in New Jersey, right? Is that they're making a market for corporate cannabis, and the people that have been growing and selling cannabis for many years are going to be left out, and they're going to continue to face penalties. What do we do?
Yeah, so for the first off, for any state that is looking to legalize, and for any advocates in other states that have not, just ensure that no state does what New Jersey did. And if it's on a ballot question and they split basically the term kind of between cannabis and marijuana. So when we voted in New Jersey, the ballot question was, you know, do you approve amending the state constitution to legalize a controlled form of marijuana called cannabis? That doesn't make sense in any manner. Scientifically, legally, it doesn't make sense because that's not even how the DEA actually defines it. And so a lot of us were very confused in the question, but the question was actually voted on during the same time that MJ BizCon was happening, which is the largest cannabis convention really in the world. And so at that time, all of the activists were in Las Vegas doing their thing. So we actually could not be there because you had to actually be there in person. So it basically passed. And then we were stuck with this question. So now, what is the implications of this question now that we voted, now that we legalized, is that now we have 2 terms. Cannabis is legalized in New Jersey under 6 ounces. Cannabis is defined as weed that is bought from a legal dispensary, while marijuana is not legalized, it is decriminalized under 6 ounces. And marijuana is weed that you get not from a legal dispensary, but, you know, just from, you know, a legacy market operator. So what we have now, right, is we have one that is criminalized, one that is, you know, legalized. And it's really confusing for folks because right now, when we don't have any adult use sales, we have no operators actually selling legal cannabis. Every cannabis basically that you have on you, unless you are a patient, is technically falls under the decriminalization statute, not the legalization statute. Now, we do have certain, provisions in the laws in the fact that smell is no longer probable cause, so they can't actually stop you if you're smelling like cannabis. But there are also violations for police officers. If they interact with you based on smell, then they are now subject to discipline, which is fantastic. But obviously, police unions are coming out very, very heavy against this, trying to really put forth bills. I read an article the other day about a police chief. He wrote as an opinion piece. And in the line, it was laughable. He said, let's think about the careers of these police officers that are at stake. And I almost, spit what I was drinking out, because I said, but you never thought about the lives that you, not just careers, but lives that you were destroying. But now you are asking us to take into consideration your career, when you should really be following the law. The law is now, if you smell cannabis on somebody, you can't do a damn thing unless you see them consuming in places where they're not supposed to, which, unlike New York, you're not allowed to consume on the street. You can consume at your house on private property, but still outside you can't. But they still cannot approach you. But if they see you lighting up in certain places, they can. But what's fantastic is that now people are going to have cases if it's just based, on smell. But we really do have to continue the work, because these police unions are coming out very strong and basically stating that we're undermining their power, we're undermining their authority, and we're really interfering with their police duties, which I don't think so at all. You have been following certain protocols for a very long time. Now there's a new protocol. Now you have to follow and fall in line.
Yeah, I mean, that's a BS argument. We know that. This is an income generator, right? Especially in a lot of these small towns, right? They stop people for all sorts of nonsense things, and they want that revenue. And what happens is they apply for a lot of these federal grants about public safety. And when they're no longer needed for public safety, they don't get that money. They have to, it's a crazy system where if you meet your goals, you make the community quote unquote safer, and you hit all your numbers, you lose the funding, right? Because you don't need to do that anymore. And they don't want that to happen. The fines that are generated by these marijuana, they have literally come out and said, what are we going to do about our revenue?
$143 million a year is what New Jersey spent annually on cannabis arrests, right? So now that we're no longer, spending that, now police are asking money for training purposes, right? And then something that New Jersey also put forth that I hope I never see in any other state is basically, and I know Jason's heard me talk about this before, is the drug recognition expert at work, where basically now you can empower civilians to get a certificate from the police. You're trained by them because obviously, they're experts. And then you are able to police people at their own job. Which I find to just be absolutely appalling. But those were the employment groups who were coming out really with these sort of police unions during the testimony period to try to really get that in. And so I would urge, anybody listening to please understand really the implications of that. Because now in New Jersey, you can be policed at work. You can be policed still on the street. And if you're renting, you can still be policed at your home. So when we're talking about legalization, a lot of this doesn't sound like legalization, at all.
Right. And to Jason's point, you can still be policed by your campus police at your university if you're a student, which is another income generator for them. Jason, you have been working hard, scrutinizing all of these bills, which getting your highlighter out. Tell us what's going on in Connecticut. Why is it so important to have people involved in this process, scrutinizing every line of these proposed bills that they're trying to put out there and get over on the public?
Yeah, because these people be playing games with our future and with our communities. And, it's amazing how one line in a bill could completely undermine entire programs in the bill. And I'm going to, because you have a limited amount of time here, go directly to a clause that is affectionately known as the Slave Masters Clause, that this is something we're dealing with in Connecticut. And it's actually part of the definition of an equity applicant. And so in SB 888, which is the governor's bill, we successfully pressured him to include equity programs in his bill. So that was definitely a win. We got the idea of equity programs in the governor's bill, including set-asides of licenses. However, when I looked at the definition of who could access these programs, there was the first one that made a lot of sense to me. It was somebody who had been either arrested, had a family member arrested, was from a disproportionately impacted area, which is squishy. I have mixed feelings about that one. Or was a member of a tribal nation in the state. And that was actually a big win for us. We got the tribal members included in equity programs as a very specific qualifier. So I felt pretty good about that. So that was one half of it. And then they added, or the entity is managed day to day by somebody who could qualify as an equity applicant. So that or added the idea that a big business could claim that they are hiring somebody who is an impacted person, and that they have criminal history or they came from a particular background. And because that person is managing the business, the whole business should be able to apply as an equity applicant. This means that the multi-billion-dollar company could apply as an equity applicant because they say, Jason is going to be managing the store, we promise. And then the day after they get the license, they can fire me. And so this allows the slave masters or the wannabe slave masters to put people of color up as token representation, but still own the entire business. And then that company, that is multi-billion-dollar equity company, can access community resources to help them be able to get their business started faster. So we got the idea of the equity program in there. The whole program is there, different pieces of it. A loan fund is in there, technical assistance, licensing set-asides, except they added, but also all the big businesses can also access all of those programs as well. And so that one line undermines the entire program. Now back to fighting with the big businesses within the poor people sector of this whole thing, right? And so it is mind-blowing to me that anyone could, literally in the definition, but in the same conversation say, the purpose of all of these programs is to undo white supremacy, to undo a racist war on drugs, to reinvest in impacted communities, but also the billionaires are gonna be part of it too, right? Like that just doesn't make sense when we're talking about public policy. And it is
capitalism.
Yeah, it's like one of the worst things I've ever heard. And just to say as how important policy change can be. Now, if we change that or to an and, right, it dramatically changes the entire program. So now you have, if we were to say you have to be an impacted person or it's managed by an impacted person, if you put it to and, they have to be both owned and managed by an impacted person. And so that is what we want to see. We want to see both of those qualifiers put on there. And that is a very small change in one section of a definition. It's actually one word that could radically change who can access that program, the success of that program, and whether or not the core foundation of legalization and equity is happening in the bill. Changing an or to an and would do that. And so that is why it is so important we have people reading every line. There are sections in the governor's bill that are literally an entire paragraph of references to other bills and other sections, right? And so you could read that and have no idea like what that is referencing. You need someone else as an expert in that other field of law, right, to be able to tell you what that means over there. Right. And so like now I know that 420F is our medical marijuana, statutes. Right. But there are books in that other statute that we have to think about that could be changed or erased. And so, the specifics of the policy, it could be worlds difference based on a few words.
I mean, I was just going to say, it's important to have advocates like all of you who are doing this work to explain it to everybody so we know what to ask for when we call the governor or when we call our legislature.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, Vanessa, and I'm going to let you keep asking questions. I know you have questions for Nelson and Jess and our fantastic panel here. But I just wanted to add, Jason, one of my experiences doing some advocacy in this industry was around a lot of our colleagues in Nevada a few years back when they were getting the industry started in Nevada. They had these laws related to, having minority representation on the board of the companies that were buying them. And so basically there was a hustle and there was an understanding like you couple of people of color, like you're on there just long enough so we can get the license. And then basically you're going to get bought out. So early on. So, people, it's not bad money. So a handful of us benefited short term, but then, basically a whole group of people that don't represent our community, in essence, there was no accountability for long-term equity. It was just that to your point in that initial application process. So there's a lot of hustles involved in these licenses that y'all are very aware of.
They're scamming. That's what they're scamming. And we've already seen this happen in other legal states like California and Colorado, and even in medical marijuana states like Pennsylvania, where they literally drop their black and brown partner like a hot potato and they exclude them from the business. This is exploitative. I feel like it's almost illegal. It's disingenuous. Like you're pretty much lying on an application. And the problem is that there's no oversight or accountability mechanisms to ensure that they keep to their word. And so that's why it's important for the public to serve as a watchdog, and journalists and media makers like myself to continue to call these things out, because otherwise they're going to get away with it. Some New York just legalized. There's vultures in New York too, right? They take up a lot of space. What are some of your concerns with the new legalization law that's been passed? What's the work ahead of you to make sure that communities of color and young people who don't have capital, because even young white kids are like, we don't have any money. How do we ensure that they're included in this new industry?
Yeah, New York definitely gives us a great opportunity. What we don't want New York to be is like some of the places you mentioned, like California and LA, where blatantly we saw people of color being abused for these license systems. And just most recently, Illinois, with Chicago legalizing, same situation. The vultures are always coming out to play. They've been here in New York for a long time. It's really just about educating and making these people aware that these opportunities are going to come, but that there are going to be other avenues to get these licenses and to successfully transition from the legacy market into this new legal market. And it's not going to happen, tomorrow. We're looking at anywhere between 18 to 24-month roadmap at this point, where, the big players will obviously have their day in the sun and be able to really operate and monetize, since they've made no money in the New York medical program over these last 6 years. But there is really a real niche opportunity in the way that the New York bill has been written to really give an opportunity for those most affected, for those previously incarcerated, to actually have an impact in the space. There's going to be a lot of these micro licenses and equity licenses, just, having home grow in there, even though it's not technically you can't grow at home and then sell it. It still, gives an opportunity for people to improve their craft, so that way they can go for these micro licenses as the program rolls out. And to also be safe with New York gave us a real good opportunity here. We took away the offensive policing, so there's not going to be a lot. The legacy market can at least, still thrive and keep growing. But, the whole point here is to really transition to that legal market. And now that we have 280, hopefully, fingers crossed, it passes, we'll also get banking as well, because that's always a big issue.
Yeah, and also one thing that New York actually did that was very unique was they are offering standalone consumption lounge licenses. And typically when we've seen them, they're always connected to a retail license or some other type of license. Like in New Jersey, it's like that. But the real good thing that New York also did, that New Jersey also did, but New Jersey only has it for 2 years. For New York, there's no time frame on it, is the banning of verticals from the inception. And that has historically been a huge barrier to entry, just because of the application fee cost and how much it really does take to build up that. So I definitely wanted to give the kudos to New York for kind of setting forth a lot of standalone type of licenses, because that's really going to help a lot of folks get involved.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we face in all of our states is people who are involved in I don't even like the word legacy market, which is people who have been growing weed, people who have been selling cannabis, people who are experts, right? People
the existing community infrastructure.
Exactly, right? It's like, I don't know legacy, but
another term.
People who have been doing this a long time. I mean, I trust the people that I know who have been growing weed for a long time more than I trust somebody that took some online course on cannabis recently, right? How do we make sure that those people with those very legitimate skills and expertise are able to qualify that? And that includes people that have been arrested and incarcerated for doing that same thing. There's a lot of places where they're not allowing people to participate in a legal industry just because they've had felony convictions or because they don't have the quote unquote certifications. I mean, do you really need a certification to grow a plant? how do we do that? How do we make sure that they also are able to participate?
So I know, so here, you know, in New Jersey, they are allowing folks who do have cannabis convictions to get involved in the industry. It's just going to really, you know, depend, but I think it goes all the way up until, you know, sort of 25 pounds. The only types of felonies that are going to be excluded are ones that have to do with truthfulness. So you're looking at fraud, you're looking at embezzlement. And typically those, a lot of times what we see is that these cannabis convictions are not, they don't stand alone. They're usually accompanied by other ones. But that is one way I think that the states are really trying. But I think in terms of getting, you know, folks, you know, from the legacy market, you know, to get involved right now, when you're looking at an application, it always requires some level of experience. And typically what you're going to have to do is partner up with out-of-state folks to really get that experience, you know, on your application. Right now, I haven't seen in any other state that has allowed, you know, to put experience, you know, from, you know, your sort of legacy market experience. I'm curious to see what that could possibly look like, but it's just not something we're seeing now.
Yeah, I almost think there should be a test people can take. Like, you don't have to go to law school to pass the bar exam, right?
Well, in California, no, but...
So they tried to do that in a previous bill in Connecticut, and I actually opposed it because it was going to be, this is what was my reason. Maybe I was wrong in thinking about this. In order for me to prove that experience, I have to admit to a crime, and there is no one that can verify any of it. However, the folks that will be able to say they have experience are people that work in the legal industries in other states, which are primarily whites. So I saw that as an opportunity for the folks that are already in the industry to come to Connecticut and say, oh, we have experience. We can do all of these different jobs for everybody. So I was actually worried it was going to push us out because we were already pushed out everywhere else. And I was concerned that it would backfire on us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, right? How do you document illegal activity on an application, right? And how do you know, what do you know, like, what are they going to do with that information?
Right.
I'm not really sure.
And one of the limitations of the equity programs is that it really only will help folks that got caught, right? Like if you were growing the whole time and never got caught, you wouldn't qualify as an equity applicant. And so that isn't like, we want the folks that are doing it now to come out and have that support, even if they weren't necessarily arrested for it. But we've seen that the programs need to be very narrow for them to even remotely achieve what the goals are. And while it is always an effort to try to broaden and make sure lots of people are helped, we have to tailor it, focus it on the folks that are most impacted, need the most help. And those generally are people that actually did interact with the criminal justice system, and leave out all these other qualifiers. The geographic qualifier, right? Just like get rid of all of that, because the list of people that have an arrest record are, generally speaking, going to be more people of color, but also very few wealthy people are going to be in that list. There are very few millionaires that get caught up on a simple weed charge, right? And so by default, because of the way society is operated, I think that is the best qualifier to keep it narrow and focus on the people that did it. And it's not necessarily race specific, but it is disproportionately in our favor because of history. But it's been interesting to see how we decide how narrow or wide the access to equity programs should be, right? And so I'll give another example, veterans, right? Veterans that lost their honorable status due to a cannabis interaction, which happens more frequently than we'd like to admit, should those folks qualify as equity applicants? That wasn't a criminal justice interaction, but they definitely had their lives ruined, right? Over what is probably simple possession, or what happens a lot, they admitted to their doctor that they used cannabis, and it caused all kinds of problems after that, right? But is that the same thing as reparations for the war on drugs, right? It's tense there, but I think it's definitely something that we should consider when we look at all these bills. We have to be very clear who we're trying to help and what kind of help we think that they deserve.
So thank you so much for all of these thoughts. We still have a lot of questions, but again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is a lifelong struggle, probably, right? So I just embrace it, accept it. I'll be working on this for the rest of my life. There's a lot of work to do, and you who are listening right there, even if you don't consume cannabis, you can help be part of this liberation and health movement. And so I'm here to recruit all of you to free the weed and to help our communities have access to this wealth and this medicine. It's really, really vital. Before we wrap up the show, I'd love for each of you to say what people can do to get involved, because at the end of the day, we're always trying to get people involved to grow this movement, to generate more support, to change public opinion. What can folks do? I'll start with you, Jess.
Sure. So I know I get this question every day. I know Jason gets this question every day. I'm sure Nelson, you also get this question all the time. And the best thing, I think that folks can do is you really got to educate about what you're really asking for and what you really want to get into. And what I find is that a lot of folks, I understand that, reading a bill is not fun really, for anybody, and the language is pretty, convoluted. But now, especially now that we've had the pandemic, a lot of these testimony periods have been taking place via Zoom. So what I've encouraged people to do is go look at those recordings. If you don't want to read through it, you then listen to the people who actually did read it and are advocating. And if it aligns with your values, then that's what you should be advocating for, right? And the other thing is people need to start talking to their families. I think when you start telling people, like, call your legislator and talk to your community and talk to all of this, they tend to get a little bit overwhelmed because they've never done something like that before. But you've damn well advocated something against your family. And if you can do that, and that can kind of have, a sort of, a much bigger effect than you really think, that's where you're going to really get your first kind of crash course in activism, is talking to especially if you're a Latino immigrant family. That's where you're going to get that experience, and then use that experience to kind of bring it on a broader, much larger scale. But I think a lot of folks, what they're happening is they're trying to jump in with 2 feet without actually knowing the landscape.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because I've been able to go to a lot of the, not go to, but like experience, attend, watch the virtual hearings in New Jersey, because our state capitals are far away sometimes. We're not able to get there. A lot of us, I can listen to a hearing and do my work at the same time. So it's definitely a good way to learn. And again, I know we get this question all the time. Whenever I would set up my table, people would come up and say, where can I sign the petition? I would say, there's no petition. Let me explain to you how community organizing works. But Jason, I'll let you give your take on what people can do to support the efforts in Connecticut.
Sure. So, there's CURE-CT, Connecticut United for Reform and Equity. That's CURE, CURECT.nationbuilder.com is the website. But I think today what I really like folks to do is to share ssdp.org with all of the young people in your life and let them come to their own conclusions about how they want to approach drugs in society. On SSDP, you'll see we have lots of youth-led programs and information, and I think we have to be engaging with all generations, right? We talked a little bit about seniors, but also our young people are in a position to be able to get into this new industry, to learn new skills, to build new careers. And I think one of the things we want to do is arm our young people with as much information and support networks as possible, and SSDP provides that for a lot of people. So I know there are Latinos out there. There are little Jason Ortizes that didn't have an SSDP around when I was in high school. Well, it's here now. So if you have questions, engage with young people, talk to them. They know a lot about the issues, a lot about the policy, and SSDP can help them turn their passion into pragmatic political power.
And you can start your own chapter if your school does not have a chapter. And so there's information about that on the SSDP website if you want to start a chapter on your campus. Nelson, again, I know you get this question all the time, but now that the law has changed in New York, how can people get active and join this movement?
Well, first and foremost, I just got to echo what, Jess and Jason have said. You got to stay informed. You got to follow some of these different organizations. Social media is a great tool to learn about these different things changing, knowing your rights. So definitely follow SSDP, follow Canna Cultural, follow M4MM. We're always spreading the good word. And also just lead by example. It starts first, obviously, at home, having those tough conversations with the family. But then it's also kind of how you interact in your day-to-day. Obviously, most of us are in quarantine or in lockdown in one way or another, but the world is slowly opening back up, and we can really show our true colors, helping out somebody answer these questions to really help make this movement grow. And hopefully in a very not too distant future, we'll all finally be able to get together in person and really just to enjoy these new laws that are coming into our states.
Yeah, and I'll add, because I'm a journalist. Tell your cannabis story. Everybody has some touch with that plant in some way. They know somebody that's been healed from it. They know somebody that's been arrested from it. That's actually what got me involved. I've never been arrested for cannabis, but so many of my friends were, and it affected their lives negatively. So, again, if you can't come out of that cannabis closet, as they say, speak your truth. Let people know how it's helped you. I think that's like the biggest, the most helpful way to get anybody to do anything, right? Is like word of mouth. Even with vaccines and COVID testing, if somebody tells you their story and how it's helped them, you're more likely to listen to them than anything you read on the internet. So talk to people, tell people how it's helped you, write about it, make media, make videos about it. Nelson has a really nice documentary he made with his abuelo, which you can check out. And I think, again, it all starts with your family, your friends, your neighbors, and, just have these conversations. And that's the thing. If you don't know anything about it, you can just ask people, tell me what you know about. People ask me all the time about CBD, about hemp, and, what strain. And there's this like hesitancy. They're like afraid. I'm like, don't be afraid. Come on, So hit us up. We're all here on this panel. We're all on social media. And send questions. We have resources to share with you. And again, the important thing is never stop learning, because we're all continuously educating ourselves and learning. New information comes to light every day. So never stop the process for learning. I'm sure, Ray, I'm sure you learned some things on today.
I've been taking notes. Are you kidding? No, I mean, it really, all jokes aside, it really does put a perspective about how cannabis policy really impacts every portion of our life in terms of the including education, including the advocacy that we're doing around these core issues. And Jason talked about this sort of in the pre-discussion around how this is a big foreign policy discussion too, as it relates to Latin American policy of the United States. And that's a whole other set of conversations, but this is the first of many. I really appreciate the time, especially on a Friday evening. Jess F. Gonzalez, I'm in New Jersey, so we definitely have to figure out ways we can continue to collaborate. Jason Ortiz, my man, we always keep in touch with each other and have some great conversations around a variety of issues on social media. And Nelson Guerrero, a new friend. And I definitely want to keep, first of all, always representing for the Ecuadorians. We need to have more Ecuadorians on the show. So I always try to rep that diversity. So really appreciate you coming to the table with your personal story and really, the big business. And, when they talk about infrastructure and this idea that when they talk about building the infrastructure of this country, everyone thinks about a 52-year-old white guy with a hard hat in Wisconsin somewhere. When the infrastructure and what is the new work for this country really looks like Jess and Nelson. And in many ways, and the rest of us. So thank you all so much for your leadership, Vanessa. Thank you for bringing not only this issue and your passion to the table, but this great set of leaders that are supporting us in a variety of ways. I give you all a lot of credit from an organizer hat perspective, because y'all have the most engaged fans that have come into this. I mean, the level of questions and engagement on the show is very, very, very intricate, and people that you brought to the table a lot of energy around these issues that, again, to Nelson's point, thank you, Nelson, because you really brought it home. It's very personal issue, and at times can be, literally sort of life and death as it relates to the for our country. Keep following BOMBA Live 2, June 12th. Follow us on all social media channels. All these folks are going to be involved in that program production and building up to it on some level. And Vanessa, thank you again for being always a great co-host and part of the family here. And we're going to wrap up the show kind of, again, in homage to someone that unfortunately, but out of the terrible incident that happened to him, George Floyd has really been a calling card or an icon as it relates to moving this movement to a good, at least legal decision this week in Minnesota. And so in homage to him on the first BOMBA Live, if folks aren't aware, great entertainer and activist Maria Isa is a Minnesota Rican, Soda Rican, as she calls herself. And she did a BOMBA in homage to her personal friend. I mean, that was one of her homies, he did security at some of the local nightclubs and music establishments she would perform. She did a BOMBA in his honor in June, and so I think it's very appropriate we end the show with a clip from that performance from our great friend Maria Isa. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll be back next week with another episode of the show. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
That's
Fuego, que fuego. Si no pone la gente se va a quemar. Si no pone la gente se va a quemar. Mi gente negra no quieren más, no quieren no sufrir. Que todo tenemos que vivir con unidad y no van a sufrir. Ay, como duele.